Richard Nixon. He was one of the most controversial presidents in the history of the United States, and the first president to resign in the middle of a term. He was the man who covered up the Watergate scandal and was almost impeached for it as he resigned before the vote. But this was a man who did many great things too in his years as president. Among them was his visit to China and the restoration of communication between the two countries. His first exploration of new and greater relations between the US and China shed light onto a new exchange of diplomacy between the two great nations, which had previously slashed all communications between each other. This historic first face-to-face encounter of American to Chinese led to our current mixed relationship with the People's Republic of China.
Chinese people in general hold very high regard for President Nixon. So President Nixon's visit to China in 1972 was a historical event. In his own word, years later, he said that changed the world.
The story starts here with the Nixon, the Chinese Civil War, a massive military conflict between two parties locked in a power struggle. The Communist Chinese Party, which wanted to establish a communist government to replace the current one, and the KMT, the party that held power at the time. When the war was finally over in 1949, the Communist Party came out victorious, forcing the Nationalist Party and the Republic of China to flee to the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. This was not good for the United States, who had sided with the KMT, the losing side of the war. As a result, Chairman Mao Zedong and the newly established People's Republic of China completely severed all relations with the U.S. For over 20 years, the U.S. banned all diplomatic relations, trade, and communication with Communist China. But after the Vietnam War, in the 60s and 70s, the two countries considered rapprochement, the restoration of a peaceful relationship. China had recently been abandoned by their former ally, the Soviet Union, and wanted to retaliate and find a way to gain a seat in the United Nations, as well as possibly gain a new ally. This abandonment of Sino-Soviet relations caused China to also reconsider their relations with the U.S. The United States wanted rapprochement with China for many reasons as well. To avoid war, to undermine communist networks of countries in Asia, to gain another ally, and to gain leverage against the Soviet Union. President Nixon first began explorations on improving relations with the PRC by establishing a secret path of communication through Pakistani President Yahya Khan when he first visited Pakistan in July 1969. As Sultan Muhammad Khan, President Khan's foreign secretary, said, Nixon mentioned to Yahya Khan that he was thinking of re-establishing contact with China. He said that it had been almost 2 decades that they broke relations with them, and there had been no official contact, and, when the time is right, he would like to get in touch and help us act as an intermediary in the re-establishment of a relationship. And, in 1971, Nixon lifted the restrictions which prevented Americans from traveling to mainland China. It seemed that finally, Americans and the Chinese would, after a 21-year estrangement, have a face-to-face meeting.
Our relationship with China is strong. We are like the best of brothers. And this all started with ping pong. It's amazing, really.
Then came what is now known as ping pong diplomacy, in which the American and Chinese teams met for the first time face-to-face since the Nixon. Guided by the hands of the United States and China, the fateful ping pong match occurred in April 1971. It was the first time in over 20 years that the American and Chinese teams had met face-to-face. It was also the first public view of re-engaging relations between the two nations, and it led to many others.
There can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
On February 21st, 1972, Richard Nixon stepped off of an airplane in Beijing, sitting in one of the few countries that had no official contact with the United States. This was a bold step, a U.S. president's first encounter with the Chinese in mainland China. After taking his first steps on that isolated land, Nixon walked up to Zhou Enlai, the prime minister, and shook his hand, a symbolic moment of peace. Nixon later recalled that Enlai said as they shook hands, "Your handshake came over the vastest distance in the world, 25 years of no communication." On that first day in China, relationships started to heal almost immediately as Mao Zedong requested an unplanned visit to talk with Nixon. Nixon and Kissinger immediately rushed to Mao's residence, where Mao met with them. As they started a casual discussion, Mao said to Nixon as they talked about politics in Asia, "All these troublesome topics I don't want to get into very much. I think your topic is better, philosophic questions." And so, Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, and Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese party that fought against the United States, made peace with each other, despite the enemies they were in the past. This surprise meeting was one of the key stops that drew the support of the citizens of China, for Mao was like a wise old father to them, and if Mao approved, then so did they. After his friendly visit with Mao, and for the rest of his trip, Richard Nixon broke down the dividing barriers of the past as he met with official after official, shaking hand after hand of the leaders of a nation feared and despised, now peacefully welcoming him with open arms.
中美两国人民愿望的积极行动，这在中美两国关系史上是一个创举。
Nixon's visit to China concluded with the Shanghai Communique. The meeting was best summed up with a quote directly from the document itself.
The two sides expressed the hope that the gains achieved during this visit would open up new prospects for the relations between the two countries. They believe that the normalization of relations between the two countries is not only in the interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the relaxation of tension in Asia and the world.
Overall, Richard Nixon's exploration of new relations with China in the 70s was a major landmark in the history of both nations. This encounter forever changed the relationship between world powers and led to a revolutionary new exchange of goods and ideas. Present-day American-Chinese relationships are still strong. China is America's fourth largest trade partner in the world, and there are an estimated 300 to 500,000 American jobs directly dependent on exports to and imports from China. However, our current relationship with China remains complex. From U.S. infringement in the South China Sea to Chinese industrial espionage, it can be described as strained at times. No one knows what the future holds for these two superpowers. Nonetheless, without the negotiations initiated by Nixon in 1972, these two nations would not have built the alliance that exists today. This exploration, encounter, and exchange truly changed the world.